get launched here and get started. So Mr. Lewis will point at me and it'll be my cue that we're ready to go with my, 38 people, 38 families that are online with us. So, hey, you're a good-looking group. I heard the sun came out, right? That's cool. That's cool. I haven't, between here and the fellowship hall, I haven't left that since like 7 o'clock this morning. So I don't know what outside looks like yet. So, but I'm excited to see it in just a few minutes and have supper. So that's a winner. Everybody doing good? Who got a nap in the rain today? Nothing better than a nap during the rain, right? And tonight I want you to join me in praying for Miss Rosemary Carason. She would normally be with us tonight. She would normally be with us this morning. And her brother passed away last Tuesday. She left on Friday to go to Syracuse, New York, where their family is from, and that service is today. So we've been praying for her, and then tomorrow she'll travel back home, fly back home, and just ask the Lord for comfort and peace for her. We'll do that in our prayer at the end. So let's jump into it. So we started 3 weeks ago talking about the life of Jesus. We thought this would be a really great time for us leading up to Easter, and we gave you the Max Lucado book, Jesus, that you can read. And then we're just teaching through the Gospels. And really what I'm doing is I'm teaching these 3 Gospels up until Easter, and then we'll teach the 4th Gospel, Luke, the week after Easter on the 16th. So let's jump into it. We kind of had to hustle through a lot last week. We don't have to do that. We get to catch our breath, slow down. We laid all this groundwork for the Gospels last week, and then tonight we get to sort of enjoy the book of John. So the first 4 books of the New Testament are called the Gospels. Now, sometimes we talk about the gospel, which the gospel is the good news of Jesus' death, his resurrection from the dead, and that's the gospel. That's the good news for us. This is a different version of the Gospels, are the presentations of Jesus' life. They're the first 4 books of the Bible. Matthew, that we talked about last week, that is centered around the discourses Jesus is teaching. In fact, there are 5 of them. And he just makes this point that Jesus is a greater liberator, a greater leader, a deliverer than Moses was. And he has 5 teachings, and Moses had 5 books. And so he's greater than all of that. And then the book of Mark that we're going to look at next week. We're going to talk about the sufferings of Christ, because that's the way that Jesus is presented. In the book of Matthew, we said last week that Jesus is the king. And Matthew goes to great extent to talk about Jesus as the king. He holds up David as the Old Testament hero who was the greatest king and the greatest leader. And he says he's from the line of David, and he sits on David's throne because Jesus is the eternal king. Mark is going to talk about Jesus is the suffering Savior. And that's what we're going to talk about next week. We're going to kind of teach through the book of Mark. And then Luke, which we're going to look at on the 16th, is this very succinct, very clear. Luke's a medical doctor, sets out to write an orderly account of Jesus' life. And Luke is going to give us this very detailed presentation and say Jesus is the Savior. He's not a sufferer. He's not just a king. He's a Savior. He's the Savior of the world. He's going to hold him up as the Son of God. And John, which we're going to look at tonight, is different. It's not like the other 3. So we call Matthew, Mark, and Luke the synoptic gospels. They're the same. They're just a different perspective, different story. John's is completely different. We'll talk about why that's true tonight. John focuses on the deity of Christ more than the other 4. And he's going to say Jesus is God. In fact, if you see the little snapshot that I put inside of there from Kenny France, who does a great job with little whiteboard teachings, I just borrowed that from Kenny and I stuck it in your notes. And Jesus is God, and he's the Son of God, and that's where he's going to begin. And specifically, John elevates Jesus as God, as a miracle worker, and with a series of I am statements. He's this compassionate teacher. We talked about that last week. He's a provider, but he's a faithful friend. We talked about that in week 1. John's going to tell us that he's the Son of God that's come to destroy the works of the devil, and that he's come in this cosmic battle between good and evil. And that's the way John 1 reads. And we're going to jump into that in just a moment. It's the persuasive gospel. It's where John's going to teach us about the 7 miracles that he's going to elevate that prove that he's God and he has everlasting life. And so the whole theme of the book of John is in John chapter 20. I put those notes on your outline for you. We'll stick them on the screen. Here's what John says at the end of his gospel, after he's given us these 7 miracles, and I've listed them for you. Then on the back, I gave you, Kenny France's kind of illustrative whiteboard teaching summary of the book of John. Now, Jesus did many other signs in the presence of the disciples. In fact, if you want to make you a note, there are 34 miracles in the Gospels. 34 miracles. Now, they're overlapping. Matthew, Mark, and Luke would each maybe describe some of them. John only talks about 7. Mark and Luke particularly tell us a lot of those miracles. Mark a lot because he focuses on the actions. Jesus does a lot of things. We're going to talk about that next week. But John's different. He only wants to zero in on 7 miracles. And John's all about 7. Remember last week I told you Matthew's all about 3s, right? And that's his number, 3. John's all about 7. We're going to look at it. It's on the back on your little outline. There are 7 I am statements. There are 7 miracles. And then after the resurrection, there are 7 appearances of Jesus. John's all about 7. 7's the number of completion. 3 is the number of the Trinity in the Bible, and that's why kind of that numerology is really important. It's not like, something weird or strange. It actually is very important because those numbers suggest certain things to us. So here's what John says in John 20 in his summary. Jesus did many other signs in the presence of the disciples, which are not written in this book. Now, he's talking about John. Now, when he says this book, this is the last of the Gospels it's written. It's written in Luke. He had seen that book. It's written in Mark. He had seen that book because it's the first one of the Gospels. And it's written in Matthew. He read that one. But it's not written in this book because he only focuses on the 7. But these are written so that you may believe. Underline that little phrase, so that you may believe. So that you may believe. That's the whole purpose of the book of John. Like John's a persuasive gospel. He's going to prove, he's going to make his point. He's like a prosecutor who's arguing a case, and he's giving this opening statement, which is chapter 1. And then he's going to present his evidence, and that's these 7 I am statements, and that's those 7 miracles. And then he's going to tell us about the resurrection. He's going to tell us about all these people that see Jesus in 7 different appearances that culminates with Jesus appearing to Simon Peter and restoring him so that Peter can preach on the day of Pentecost. So that you may believe that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God. There's the theme. That's the whole purpose. That's the aim of everything that John is trying to do in his gospel. And that by believing you may have life in his name. Like this is how you have eternal life. Now, all the Gospels have a different beginning. Next week with Mark begins with Jesus' adult ministry because it's all about action. It's a short book, 16 chapters, and he only spends about 10 chapters talking about Jesus' life, and then in chapter 11, he's right already at the death of Jesus. Different, like Luke spends a long time to get to chapter 23 and get us to the death of Jesus. Matthew spends a long time to get to chapter 26 and the death of Jesus. But Mark wants to get to that. We'll talk about that next week. Matthew and Luke, they begin with Jesus' physical birth. Matthew, if you just want to make you a note, tells us about Joseph's lineage, Joseph's side of the family tree. Luke tells us about Mary's family and her background. Matthew tells us all about Joseph and the angel Gabriel coming to Joseph and a night and telling him in a dream that this child that's being born is from heaven. It's conceived by God the Father through the Holy Spirit. Luke tells us all about Mary's side, Mary's perspective, Mary's story. It's all about Gabriel the angel coming to Nazareth and telling her that she's going to have a child and it's conceived by the Holy Spirit. So there's a different perspective. Again, this is the purpose of us having 4 Gospels, because we get a different narrative, a different perspective, a different look altogether. So Mark, all about Jesus' ministry. Matthew, all about Joseph. And Luke, all about Mary. And Luke and Matthew begin with the birth of Jesus. But John, completely different. John goes way back. In fact, John goes all the way back to Genesis chapter 1, verse 1. So in John chapter 1, and we call John chapter 1 the epilogue. The prelogue. It's the beginning. It's like the prelude to everything. This is the summary of John's theology. And here's his verse. In the beginning was the Word. And just circle the word, because you see that it's capitalized. Like when we use the word, we mean one thing. It's words, whether they're written, whether they're spoken, whether they're memorized. We mean the same thing. Spoken word, written word, it's the word, right? In their day, they had different words. They had the word graphe, that's the written word. They had the word logos, that's the spoken word, the living word. It was not something that was written down ancient from long ago, something alive and real, spoken right now, logos. And then they had the rhema word. A rhema word would be something active and powerful, like it was spoken and it came to life. Jesus is the Word, and the word is capitalized because it's a name. It's a name, and it's God. And so we were saying in the beginning was God, just like Genesis 1:1 begins. And the Word was with God, and the Word was God. So again, I told you, John's a persuasive book. He's a courtroom lawyer, and he's going to argue his case. And he walks over to the jury, which is everybody reading, and he goes, Jesus is the Son of God, right from the beginning. And then John's going to prove it. And then John's going to tell us that Jesus is incarnate through the gospel with these 7 I am statements of Jesus. And so these 7 I am statements through the book, and they're on your listing there. You can just kind of see them. All prove that he's God. Now, everybody that heard Jesus say, I am, they knew what he was referring back to. This goes all the way back to Exodus chapter 3, when God appears to Moses in the desert at the burning bush and calls Moses and says, I've seen my people's affliction. I've heard their travail. And I'm going to come down and I'm going to rescue you. And then he tells him, Moses, and I'm sending you to Pharaoh, which if you remember, that's who raised him, right? That's where he grew up. You're going right back to where you came from. Now, he stuttered. And Moses kind of argues with God. He's like, you shouldn't send me. I don't speak so well. You should send my brother. My brother Aaron, he speaks very well. I stutter. So he's got all these excuses why it shouldn't be him. And God says, I'm sending you. And so Moses then says to God, and we'll put the verse up for you. Here you go. Suppose I go. Let's go back, Val. Suppose I go to the Israelites and I say to them, the God of your fathers has sent me to you. So long before he goes to Moses, he's got to go back to the children of Israel. Now, this is a problem too, right? Because he left there 40 years ago when he ran away, anybody know? Committed capital murder. He killed somebody, and he ran away to the desert. And this is where he's been gone for 40 years, and now he's going to show back up. I know the last time you saw me, I murdered somebody, but God has sent me to deliver y'all and bring you out of Egypt. Can we all say awkward moment, right? Awkward moment, so you can see why he stutters. You can see why he struggles. You can see why he's like arguing with God. Send Aaron. Aaron's good. He hasn't killed anybody. That was a joke, by the way. So, sometimes you're like, do I laugh or not? Send Aaron. But, God chose Moses, okay? Here's what he says. The God of your father sent me to you, and they asked me, what is his name? What is his name? Now, throughout the Old Testament, nobody had ever seen the name of God. They knew God. They knew him as Elohim. the Almighty Creator God. But nobody knew what his name was. And this is what God says. Then what shall I tell them? And God said to Moses, I am who I am. See, the I am is capitalized. This is his name. This is who he is. This is what you are to say to the Israelites, I am sent me to you. Now, let's just kind of learn a little bit about Hebrew, and then we'll learn a little bit about what Jesus said. In Hebrew, the Hebrew phrase, I am, is the verb to be. Okay? It's the verb to be. Just write that down, the verb to be. I am the be. So I'm be. Not, and the word verb and the verb to be is ever present, ever eternal. I am, I'm the existing one. Like he's not I was or I will be or I am right now. It means I always have been and I always will be. I'm the eternal, ever-present, existing one. That's the Hebrew verb to be. That's who he was. So this is what Jesus is going to do in John. And John's very, very clever about it. John writes down these 7 I am statements. The other guys, they don't do that. John thinks this is big evidence to prove who he is. So Jesus is going to use these phrases, I am. And John's going to tie it to sort of that Old Testament name of God as proof that he's God. Everybody with me? So John's persuasive. John's proving that he is God. I am has sent me to you. So Jesus makes 7 I am statements, and they're all wrapped around these miracles that he performs. So let's just kind of jump into that list for a moment. Here we go. He starts out with I am the bread of life in John chapter 6. Now this is right after Jesus had fed the 5,000. So if you just want to make you a note, he's fed the 5,000 and everybody's amazed by that. Now, we'll look at that miracle in a moment, but we're going to learn a brand new math formula. So Jesus takes 5 little fish, 5 little fish, 2 loaves, and he's going to make 5,000 to sit down and eat. I mean, it's a miracle. And then Jesus is going to say in this profound I am statement, I'm the bread of life. Just like you ate something that satisfied you. In fact, in the verse, he says, you've eaten and you're satisfied, but he who comes to me will never hunger, and he who comes to me will never thirst, because I am the bread of life. Now, when Jesus says the bread of life, they all immediately thought about manna from the Old Testament, right? They thought about this bread that fell from heaven that was perfect, and it lasted all day long. But if they tried to store it up and bottle it up, it spoiled overnight. This is why Jesus said, man shall not live by bread alone, but by every word. In other words, you got to trust God. You got to believe God for that day. You couldn't store it up and add it for the next day because they had to trust that the next morning the manna was going to be out there for them in the wilderness. So when he says, I'm the bread of life, it was connected to that miracle. So Jesus, I'm the bread of life, but that's just kind of an empty statement until he can multiply food and feed 5,000 people with nothing, basically. Okay, we'll jump into that miracle. All right, the second one, the second I am statement, I'm the light of the world. In John chapter 8, this is right after Jesus has lifted up this woman who's been caught in adultery, who was in this really dark moment in her life. And Jesus says, I'm the light of the world. So he is telling us about his cosmic power. Like he's not just light, but he's the light of the world. He doesn't just light up a small, like we sometimes say, I just want to be a light where I am. He's not just being a small geographical light. He's the light for the whole world. He's this cosmic power that is beyond dimension. Now, in a little while, we're going to talk about how Jesus is going to heal a nobleman or a soldier's son, a ruler's son, and that son is going to be healed. But Jesus isn't going to go there, and Jesus isn't going to touch him. He's just going to speak the word, and when that man gets home, he's going to be healed. And it's because he has these powers that are beyond space and time and beyond geographical distance. And that's what he's declaring in I'm the light of the world. Then Jesus says, I'm the door to the sheep. I'm the door to the sheep. In this passage, and this is one of those ones that infuriated the Pharisees because the Pharisees had thought that they were the door. They thought that the path to heaven and a relationship with God passed directly through them. They had egotistically believed that they were the ones that said, you're good and you're not. And they had dishonestly abused that some in the temple. They made sacrifices difficult for certain people. They made sacrifices expensive for certain people. This is the whole reason why a little later Jesus turns over the money changer's table in the temple, because these Pharisees were like extortionists and they were taking advantage of poor people and often people that couldn't afford sacrifices because they were the way. And Jesus said, they're not the way. In fact, Jesus starts out this whole passage in John chapter 10 by saying, there are false teachers and there are false shepherds and there are false people who believe that they are the way. He said, but I'm the door. I'm the door, and the sheep come in through me. Okay? So Jesus is giving that I am, again, all the way back to Moses' name for God, and he's saying just like God's the I am, I'm the I am, and then he adds this description of it to it. And then in that same passage in John chapter 10, just a few verses later, he's going to say, I'm the good shepherd. I'm the good shepherd. Now, everybody knew that their hero was who? David. David was a shepherd. And then David wasn't just a shepherd. David even wrote us a song about a shepherd, right? And this psalm is really powerful. You know, the Lord is my shepherd. And what Jesus was doing was say he was connecting that passage with him as the door, and I'm this good shepherd. But this shepherd's going to be different. I'm not just going to feed my sheep. Like David in his psalm, David said, you know, the Lord is my shepherd and I don't want. He leads me beside still waters. You know, he restores my soul. And he tells us, you know, he leads me in the paths of righteousness for his name's sake. And when I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I don't fear evil because you're always with me and your rod and your staff. I mean, people love that. They comfort me. I read that sometimes to people in hospice care and they just cry. They cry because they know that the Lord is near them, right? We love this. We read it like Mr. Bryan hears it over and over and over again at funerals because it's just so powerful. You know, it's just, you hear it so much in you, but it's so powerful in that moment, right? Because it's very tender, like God is with us right now. And that's what they knew as this shepherd, right? And Jesus was saying, like David was a good shepherd, and David told us about God as a good shepherd, and Jesus said, I'm God and I'm the best shepherd. And then he adds the part, just make you a note right there beside it, there's a little space there, because I lay down my life for the sheep. And this is the first time in John that Jesus talks about his death. Not as a shepherd that feeds, not as a shepherd that protects, not as a shepherd that guides, not as a shepherd that just like puts the sheep on his shoulders when he's broken or hurt and carries it back home, but I'm the shepherd that's going to give his life for the sheep. You know, I'm not like these other guys, and it's just a very powerful contrast. These other guys, they're frauds. They think they're the way. They think they're a good shepherd. They're not. I'm the one that's going to lay down my life for the sheep. And then in John 11, you have the next of those, which is at the death of Lazarus, which is miracle number 7. We'll come to that one in a moment. Direct tie to this. So Lazarus, his buddy, because Jesus had often gone to the home of Mary and Martha and Lazarus. Now, there's these series of Marys all through the New Testament. They sometimes confuse people, you know. So you have Mary Magdalene, you know, who was like demon-possessed. And then you have Mary, the mother of Jesus. And then you have Mary, that was the sister of Martha, who was the brother of Lazarus. And so sometimes people kind of put those two together. They're not the same person. Mary Magdalene, not Mary, the sister of Martha, and their brother is Lazarus. But Jesus hears that his friend Lazarus is sick. And the Bible tells at the beginning of chapter 11 that Jesus did not go. In fact, John tells us, and kind of in a parenthetical explanation, that Jesus chose to wait until after Lazarus had died. And in fact, the disciples, he has this really funny play on words. Jesus said, our friend Lazarus is asleep. And you know, you nod your head, right? You remember this, right? And then Peter says, let's go wake him up, you know, if he's asleep. And Jesus is like, he's died, you know, which is how the Bible would describe it. And then Jesus says, and for your sake, I'm glad that I was not there. which shocked them, right? Like they knew if Jesus went when like Lazarus is sick, he could pray for him and Lazarus would get better. They had seen that. I mean, the book of Acts tells us about like Peter's mother-in-law got sick and Jesus went and prayed for her and she got better. And they had seen Jesus, heal the sick. And so, like if he could just get over there before Lazarus gets too bad and he could heal him. But Jesus was planning something different. See, they wanted Jesus to heal, but Jesus wanted them to know the power of the resurrection. And so this is the seventh most powerful miracle of Jesus. We'll come back to it in just a moment when we look at the 7 miracles. But then Jesus tells Mary and Martha these very powerful words, and again, that we use it at funeral services, often at gravesides. I am the resurrection and I am the life. Like our students that are doing talent, we had to clear our stage because like talent's here on Saturday at our church, and we got like 97, I reversed the number. 97 of our kids are involved in talent in some form. That's pretty powerful, right? And they're doing this little drama, and like some of your kids are in it, and it's about this little girl that died, but it's about the power of the resurrection and the power of comfort, the power of healing. I just got to tell you, it'll tear you out the frame. Just if you're a parent, it'll just destroy you. And it's just the power of hope and the power of heaven. And it's because of what Jesus said, I am the resurrection and the life. But those words were meaningless until he says the most powerful words that we'll look at in the miracle just 3 verses later, Lazarus, come forth. He calls Lazarus out of the grave. So there's this connection between what he says and what he does. Like we always have this in our life, right, where there's what people say and then there's what people do. Like how many of you are frustrated when people say something but they don't do it? Right? Like we're all, if you're like me, you're nodding your head. You're like, if you can't do it, just tell me. But, we get frustrated when people say it, but they can't do it. Here Jesus says, I'm the resurrection, and just so you know I'm the resurrection, he's going to call Lazarus back from the grave. So that's a powerful moment. And then in John 14, just a little bit later, they're going to talk about heaven and how do we get to heaven. And, like James and John are like, Lord, how do we know the way? And Thomas, we give him the bad rap with the bad name, right? Doubting Thomas. He's number 6 in that appearance, by the way, of people that Jesus saw after the resurrection. Doubting Thomas led, Lord, how do we know the way? And Jesus said, I am the way. I am the truth, and I'm the life. Like he just kind of clarifies it, and our culture needs this so much, right? Because we think there are all these different ways to heaven. All these different paths, and Jesus has made it clear, I'm the way, I'm the truth, I'm the life. And then in John 15, in the upper room, he said, I'm the vine. My Father is the vine dresser, he's the gardener, he's the husbandman, depending on what translation of it you read, and you're the branches. And if you stay connected to me, you can bear fruit, and you can have joy. But if you get disconnected from me, you don't have fruit, you don't have joy. And if you abide in me, you can produce much fruit. But Jesus said, apart from me, you can't do anything. And so you have this powerful, powerful thing that is happening in his life. So those are those 7 I am statements. When you read through the book of John, our staff right now, we're reading through the Gospels. We read through Matthew last week, and then we're reading through Mark this week. And then we talk about it on Tuesday, and then we'll read through Luke the next week, and we'll talk about it. Then we'll read through John, and we'll talk about it. Because it only takes you about 1 hour and 15 minutes to read through it. John's Gospel, a little longer. It's a little bit like Luke, a little bit longer. Mark, really short, about 45 minutes to read through Mark. And then about 1 hour and 15 minutes, if you're like me, I'm a really, really super slow reader. And so about 1 hour and 15 minutes for me, maybe an hour for some of you because you read pretty fast. And just read through it because the Gospels are meant to be read through in one sitting. I know we kind of read them in verses and sections and chapters, but they're meant to us to kind of get the flow of the narrative of it. So in chapter 1, you have sort of the prelude where he's going to kind of tell us a little bit. In fact, Kenny France in his outline calls it the prologue. I mean, it's just kind of like this is the introduction where he's come in the flesh and he's come to dwell among us. And he's going to use words like life. In him was life, and that life became the light of all mankind. He's going to use words like he came to his own. And he's talking about his own people, his own planet, his own trees, his own rocks, his own grass that he had made. and his own didn't receive him, his own people. And John's going to do a powerful thing. By the way, when you read that in John chapter 1, verse 11, he came to his own, and his own did not receive him. They're not the same word. Remember, I told you how in the Greek language they have these multiple words for things. The first word, own, he came to his own, is a word that means inanimate objects. He came to his own planet. He came to his own rocks. He came to his own trees. It's called a feminine, gender-neutral verb, a noun. So it's not people, it's not living creatures, it's inanimate objects. He came to his own planet and the creation. And then the second word, own, he came to his own, and his own received him not, is actually masculine, which means it's objects, living, breathing objects, his own people, the Jewish people. His rocks and trees and grass, they recognized him. They praised him. But the own people, the Jewish people, they did not. And this is John's point, is that, and we're going to look at that in a moment, all these miracles are done, but they didn't believe. They rejected Jesus as the Savior. In verse 14, it tells us that Jesus had come in the flesh. And the Word became flesh and dwelt among us. This is where John introduces us to the word incarnation, to the idea that he wasn't born, he became flesh. He always existed. He's the Son of God. He is God, and he's the eternal one. And he came and he became flesh and dwelt among us. Now, the word dwelt among us means he lived here. He moved into our neighborhood and became just like us. And because he was in the flesh, he knows all the challenges of our life and what our lives are like. Now, let's jump past the kind of the prologue introduction here, and let's get to the 7 miracles, okay? So I'm going to go to number 2 on your outline. I'm going to jump through number 1 because we're kind of running out of time. Number 2, book number 2, John writes 4 books. Chapter 1, and then in chapter 2 to chapter 12, he starts in the second book, which is all about the book of signs. It's the book of miracles. These 7 miracles that he's going to tell us about that are going to prove his divinity, but they're also going to give us these dimensions about his miraculous power. And John's going to hold him up as a miracle worker. So when we look at Jesus' life and we want to kind of get a summary, we want to kind of, get it condensed down to something we can get our handle on, because all the world couldn't hold the books that could be written about Jesus. Luke says and John says, how do we do that? He was a friend of sinners. We looked at that at week 1. He came to seek and save the lost. That's what that's about. Week 2, last week, we talked about the fact that he's a teacher, and he came to teach us about God. He came to teach us about heaven. So that's the whole point of the parables, is that they're all about heaven. They're all about God. He's coming to tell us what God is like and what heaven is like. They knew what the Romans were like, but they didn't know what God was like. And they knew what Palestine was like, but they didn't know what heaven was like. And so he's going to come and tell them all that. And now this week he's a miracle worker, so it's about these 7 miracles. And then next week he's a suffering servant. He's going to come and give himself as a sacrifice for sin. 7 miracles. That's all John wants to give us. And they're going to be proof, and there's 7 different dimensions. His first miracle is in John chapter 1. This is the miracle where Jesus turns water into wine. Anybody ever heard the famous Jerry Clowers comedy routine about when the guy was carrying bootleg liquor in his car back in Mississippi, where they all grow up, and he was stopped and he told the man it was water, and the police officer tasted it and it was liquor, and he said, "Praise God, he done it again." Classic Jerry Clowers, kind of thing. My friend Herb Anderson, who I love dearly, him and Bo's father, Mr. Jim, and Jack Azell, they were all 3 like my dad that I've never had. And I loved him. But Herb was a salesman for Bush Hog for years, and he flew a lot of places. And on 2 separate occasions, he actually sat beside Jerry Clowers on a plane. And one of them was like a cross-country trip from California. He said he thought he was going to die. He laughed so hard all the way home with that man entertaining people. But if you've never listened to Jerry Clowers and talk about, Mississippi and where he grew up and all of his stories like that, that's good comedy. That's good stuff. So just a little fun. If you're like me, kind of a simple person, that stuff's funny to you. If you're not, it's probably not so funny to you. You're just like, this mess is corny, okay? All right, so he turns water into wine. And not just any wine, this was fine wine, because at the end, they said, and this was an embarrassment to the guests because they had this wedding and they had run out of what we would call wedding cake. The thing that you would celebrate and kind of culminate the night with. All you ladies, you're at a wedding, it's getting really late. People like me are like, let's go home. I'm tired, got to preach tomorrow. And they're like, Lynn's like, we got to wait till they cut the cake. And I'm like, well, let me go up there and help them with that then. I'll go cut the cake, Because this always seems like it takes forever to cut the cake, right? Now, when our daughter got married a year ago, it could have lasted all night and I was fine with that. It's funny when it's your wedding and when it's not your wedding, right? But they had run out of wine, which is like the wedding cake. This was embarrassing. And Jesus is there. He's on the invitation. Mary is there. His mother, she's on the invitation. So these are good people that are there. The disciples are all there. Jesus has brought them along, like I come and my friends all come with me. And Mary comes to Jesus and goes, you got to do something. You got to do something. And Jesus says, this is not my time. This is not my party. This is not my wedding. And then he looks at the father and he goes, whatever he says to do, you do it. And then Jesus says, fill some pots with water. And then he turns water into wine. This just proves his miraculous power over nature, over molecules of water. He's going to take water and he's going to suspend sort of the natural laws. That's what a miracle is. It's where God suspends the natural order and natural law. Now, God can do this because why? It's his order. It's his laws. He created everything, and he turns water into wine, and they all had to submit to his authority. And then you have the second miracle, which is in John chapter 4, and this is the healing of the nobleman's son. And that's why this miracle, I mentioned it a moment ago, like Jesus proves his cosmic power. Not in Star Wars kind of cosmic power. My family has gotten into Star Wars. I've never seen this stuff in my life, which is weird. Right? Raise your hand if you've never seen Star Wars. Okay, good. I feel good. All right, raise your hand if you love Star Wars and you got to watch it all the time. Okay, all right. Lewis is up there. The staff, about 3 days a week, all eat together and watch Star Wars. And they say to me, hey, why don't you come eat with us and watch Star Wars? And I say, I'm busy watching paint dry in my office right now, which is what I would rather do. Offensive to all these people because May the 5th is coming and it's like Star Wars Day. Funny story. I don't mind telling you, this is live streaming. If he sees it, he knows it, and it's funny. I ain't got time to tell this story, but I'm going to tell it anyway. So in fact, I'll tell you when it was. It was the day that the world shut down. Anybody remember this day? Like when, on Friday, the 14th of March, 3 years ago, right? I was in Gulf Shores, Alabama, and our denomination was rewriting its bylaws, and we were meeting with the executives and what is called in our denomination the Council of Bishops for the first time, and we were just kind of walking them through. And so I'm doing this presentation. I've been asked by the committee to kind of walk Dr. Beecham, my presiding bishop, through all these things. And we were proposing some things that he was not in favor of. And I was saying, sir, here's our perspective. Here's what we were saying. And it had got a little bit testy. Okay, let's just say it that way. Little tense. We were right there in this big kind of resort, but this glass front in Gulf Shores, Alabama. The waves were running in, and I just said, sir, see it this way. And he's like, I don't like this. I don't want to think I want to see it that way. And honestly, the truth is, I was getting text messages from here that the governor is shutting us down, and I'm just looking out the window going, what am I going to do on Sunday? I mean, this was like unprecedented, right? I mean, I'm like, this can't be true, and so people are sending me messages, and Ken, who was saying, hey, they're going to shut schools down on Monday. I don't think you're having service on Sunday. And I'm watching that, and again, the room was kind of tense, and he said, Bill, you're thinking about something. And I said, I just realized, Dr. Beecham, that Elvis died in March of 1977. And he said, okay. And I said, did you know that Star Wars came out in August of 1977? And he said, I don't think I understand the point. Now, everybody's kind of tense, uptight, because it'd be kind of an exchange. And like the council of bishops are all looking down the table at me. And I just said, I just think if he could have seen that movie, it would have changed everything. Like Elvis could still be alive. Like it would have changed his life. You know, and everybody laughed, and it kind of took the pressure off, and it was kind of funny. So I thought it was a funny moment. You didn't like it so much, but it kind of scrubbed some of that tension of that moment away. But you know, Jesus is not like this cosmic Star Wars power, right? Because it's his world, it's his cosmos, it's his rules. And so the nobleman's son was healed at a long distance. And he was just proclaiming himself as the Lord of longitude and latitude. Like distance doesn't make any difference to him. He's the one that created space and time and the dimensions, and he knows everything, and he's over the chronological limitations and geographical limitations. In other words, he was just proving, like, I have power over everything. So he said these I am statements, but now he's going to prove them by all these things that he's going to do. Then in John chapter 5, he's going to heal this man at the pool of Bethesda, who had been lame for 38 years. This man who had not moved, who has one of the saddest statements in the Bible, by the way. In the Old Testament, there's this really sad statement where David said, nobody cared about my soul. Like, nobody cared if I lived or died. It's a sad statement. Jesus on the cross, when he says, my God, why do you forsake me? Sad statement, heartbreaking to read it. In John chapter 5, you had this really sad statement by the man that was at the pool of Bethesda, because there was sort of like a little legend that if you lay by the pool of Bethesda, when the water started moving, it was believed that the angels were stirring the water, and whoever get into the water first could be healed. And they asked, you know, like why do you not get into the pool? And he said, I have no man to help me when the waters are disturbed. Like everybody else had people that came with them, but this guy was apparently by himself. And Jesus just very compassionately heals this man, tells him to get up and walk. I mean, it's a powerful story, right? And the man gets up and he uses these three phrases. He walked, he leaped, and he jumped, and he praised God. I think that's what we would all have done, right? I mean, he hadn't walked in 38 years, which is a miracle of its own, because if you sort of think about it kind of in, you know, like Dr. DeRuggio's not here, but, you know, in orthopedic terms, if you haven't walked in 38 years, anybody ever been in a cast for about 6 weeks? You get in a cast for about 6 weeks, you don't really like go back to just using it, do you? And if you've been lame for 38 years, you don't just have strength back unless you are miraculously healed, right? And that's why it's so powerful. It says he leaped and walked and he praised God, because God had divinely healed that man. Then you have the feeding of the 5,000 in John chapter 6 that we talked about earlier, where Jesus has power to multiply and he has power to provide. This is where we get this new math formula that 5 plus 2 doesn't equal 7. It equals 5,000 with a remainder of 12. Like our reason, we were talking about in the staff meeting on Tuesday, I've always thought that the 12 basketfuls left over is funny, because the disciples didn't believe that Jesus could do it. Like Philip asked Jesus to send the crowd away, and then Jesus says, you feed them, all in this kind of category of this conversation in chapter 6. And Philip's like, how are we going to feed all these people? You know, like 200 days' wages, 200 denarii would not feed this crowd of 5,000. And Jesus said, have them to sit down, and then let's see what you have. And that's when Andrew, this same Andrew who brings, you know, his brother Peter to meet Jesus, brings this little boy with his little bag lunch, and his 5 little loaves and his 2 fish. And Jesus multiplies it and feeds 5,000. And then you have 12 basketfuls left over. I think there were 12 basketfuls left over. That meant that every one of those disciples had to carry a basket full of food around the rest of the day, just to remind them, hey, I can do miracles, and I can do stuff you think I can't do. And isn't it like God to sometimes just do things that kind of can remind us, discomfort us, to remind us how powerful he is? In that same day in John chapter 6, is the day that Jesus walks on water. By the way, this is recorded in Matthew chapter 12 in the same order for us. Matthew 12, John 6, they're the same. It's the longest day in Jesus' ministry, longest day in Jesus' life, because he gets up early in the morning and they tell him very first thing that John the Baptist has been beheaded. And then Jesus is grieving. He wants to go to the mountains. In fact, John does a very good job of saying he pulled away. He was going to go to the mountains to depart. He wanted to get away from everybody. He wanted to grieve. He was overwhelmed and heartbroken, but all these people follow him. And then in John chapter 12, Jesus tells all these parables. In John chapter 13, all day long. He teaches all day long. And that's when, at the end of the day, Philip comes and says, send them all away. They got to go home and eat. And Jesus says, you feed them. Let's not send them home hungry. And they're like, we can't do this. And then the whole miracle of the 5,000 feeding happens. Then Jesus puts the disciples in a boat, and he goes up on the mountain to pray in John chapter 6. And while he's on the mountain praying, the disciples are down in the storm. And this is when Jesus walks on the water. And Peter says, Lord, if it's you, bid me to come to you. And then, Peter walks on water. And then Peter sinks. And then Jesus lifts him up. And they get in the boat. And then they go to shore. And Jesus speaks to the wind and the waves. And he calms them down. All that happened in one day. Now, that's a day, right? Some of us have had a day, but that's a pretty eventful day. Matthew logs it in pretty good. John logs it in pretty good for us. He tells us in that story that he's in control of everything that seems to be out of control in our life. Aren't you glad about that? That God is in control of that? And then the sixth miracle is he heals the blind man. He heals the blind man. Now, Mark's going to talk about this because Mark bookends Jesus talking about his death by telling us about a blind man being healed, and then Jesus tells us his third time about his death, predicts it. We'll do it next week, and he heals a blind man because it's clear that the Jewish people couldn't see Jesus for who he is. Now, what's significant about that, and Dr. Chestnut is with us tonight, is that this man was born blind, which means that he didn't have an optic nerve or didn't have the synapses that connected the optic nerve to the visual cortex in the brain. So he wasn't just blind like he had seen and something had happened to his eyes. It wasn't just that something had happened to his cornea or his lenses. He didn't have the apparatus that connected the two. Jesus created in this moment. That's why this little teeny detail is so important when John tells us that this man was born blind, that he had never seen. This wasn't just that Jesus did a little magic, for somebody that needed some context and maybe had cataracts. He created in this moment. Everybody with me? This was a powerful, powerful moment. And then number 7, the most powerful and the biggest of Jesus' miracles is when he raises Lazarus from the dead in chapter 7. This is when the grim reaper, death, meets the grave robber, Jesus. And he calls Lazarus out of the grave to prove that Jesus doesn't just make bad people good, but Jesus makes dead people alive. And that's the whole point of that miracle. And yet, in spite of that, in chapter 12, we're told that people didn't believe. In fact, look at this. In John chapter 12, look at these verses. And even after Jesus had performed, these are John's words now in John chapter 12, even after Jesus had performed so many signs in their presence, they still would not believe in him. This is to fulfill the word of Isaiah the prophet. He's going to quote from Isaiah 53. Lord, who has believed our message? This is Isaiah 53:1. And to whom is the arm of the Lord revealed? For this reason, they could not believe because, as Isaiah says elsewhere, and that's going to quote from Isaiah chapter 6, he has blinded their eyes and hardened their hearts. This is the whole, again, blinded eyes. You with me? This is why Jesus was making his point to them, so that they can neither see with their eyes nor understand with their hearts, nor turn and I would heal them. Isaiah said this because he saw Jesus' glory and spoke about him. Now, isn't that phrase powerful? Isaiah's writing about Jesus prophetically 750 years before he's born. And Isaiah says, Jesus said this because Isaiah could see him. It's a play on words. Do you see it? It's the word see. Healed a blind man. They couldn't see that Jesus is the Son of God. Isaiah kind of predicted this. Isaiah saw it, and the people couldn't recognize it. Isaiah 750 years earlier, and he could see it. People that were living alive in Jesus' day couldn't see it. You with me? Powerful play on words in that moment. Because Jesus is this miracle-working God who does all things. Now, we got 17 minutes of video here with Max Lucado. That's going to take you to 7:03. Everybody okay? I apologize. All right, here we go. Let me just get us going.
The house sits quiet most of the time. Few people have caught more than a passing glimpse of its resident. Few on the street know her name. No one knows her story. They don't know her world is midnight black, grope in the dark and hope for help black. They don't know she's been suffering for years, 12 long and painful years. They don't know she's seen many doctors about her condition, too many at this point to count. And they don't know she's paid thousands of dollars to specialists and thousands more on medications to alleviate the pain. Sure, there have been promising signs along the way. A doctor who was certain he had the cure, a new treatment on the market that gave her hope she could return to a normal life. By this point, she's tried them all. But in the end, it's been to no avail. It's not just the physical symptoms that cause her distress. It's also the sense she gets when she sees her neighbors that she is different from them. And she knows she will never have the lives they enjoy, a life free from constant visits to the doctors, a life that seems so unrestricted and at ease. She wonders if anyone could ever really understand what she's going through. What would Jesus say to a person like this if he were to pay a visit to your neighborhood? In his day, there were all kinds of people who suffered from all kinds of illnesses. And to make matters worse, those with such conditions were often shunned by society. But Jesus took a different approach. He went into the towns and countryside and sought out those who had been affected by all forms of ailments, and he healed them. Jesus was willing to reach out to anyone in his neighborhood who came to him in need. And as we will see, he is still willing to reach out in compassion to those who are suffering today. You have to wonder how long it took Matthew to realize that being a disciple of Jesus was going to be different than anything he had expected. It's only a few short verses after we read of Matthew accepting Jesus' invitation to follow him that we find the former tax collector present with Christ as he heals 2 blind men and raises a girl from the dead. The crowds who witness these events are stunned, and they can only say, "Nothing like this has ever been seen in Israel." I have to think that Matthew felt the same way. In a later scene, Matthew describes how Jesus went up on a mountainside one day, and the crowds came to him, bringing along their friends and loved ones who were suffering from all forms of physical ailments. Jesus is with them for 3 days, hearing their stories, sharing firsthand in the pain they are experiencing. But he does more than just lend a compassionate ear. As Matthew writes, great crowds came to him, bringing the lame, the blind, the crippled, the mute, and many others, and laid them at his feet, and he healed them. Many times I wish that Matthew and his fellow gospel writers had been a bit more descriptive. This is one of those times. And he healed them is too short a phrase to describe what must have been an astonishing sight. Let your imagination go for a moment. Picture the blind husband seeing his wife for the first time. His eyes gaze into her tear-filled ones like she was the queen of the morning. Or envision the man who had never walked, now walking. You can bet he didn't want to sit down. He's running and jumping and doing a dance with the kids. Then there's the deaf woman who can now hear. For the first time, she hears her child call her mama. And what about the mute who can now speak? Oh boy, he's over there at the fire, chatting it up with anyone who will listen. He's singing and saying anything and everything that he had ever wanted to express. For 3 days it goes on like this. Person after person, mat after mat, crutch after crutch, smile after smile. If we ever had cause to wonder if Jesus really understands our human suffering, this event provides the answer. For 3 days, Jesus is there in the midst of every type of suffering imaginable. We have no record of preaching or teaching or instructing or challenging during this time. He's just there with them, sharing in their pain and healing them. You can only wonder at what Matthew and the other disciples must have felt when they saw Jesus time and again go out of his way to engage with the poor, the needy, the sick. In their Jewish culture, sickness was generally viewed as a form of divine justice for a person's sin. We know this because one time when Jesus and the disciples walked by a man who had been born blind, they asked, "Rabbi, who sinned, this man or his parents, that he would be born blind?" Some rabbis of the time apparently taught that an infant could sin while still in the mother's womb, and that such sin could account for inherited defects. On the other hand, the disciples knew from their Torah studies that children are punished for the sin of their parents to the third and fourth generation. So they're not sure which position is the correct one, so they asked Jesus, their rabbi, for a clarification. The surprising answer from Jesus is none of the above. To get at the root cause, you have to trace this condition back to heaven. The reason the man was born sightless was so the works of God might be displayed in him. Talk about a thankless role. Some sing to God's glory, others teach to God's glory. Who wants to be blind for God's glory? Which is tougher to accept, the condition or discovering it was God's idea? Well, the cure proves to be as surprising as the cause. Jesus spat on the ground and made clay of the spittle and applied the clay to his eyes. Jesus places a fingerful of this spit putty on the man's eyes and tells him to wash it off in the nearby pool. The result? Well, the result is the first chapter of Genesis just for him. Light where there was darkness. John describes what happens next. So he went away and washed and came back seeing. Come on, John. Where's the description? How about he raced back seeing? He danced back seeing. He roared, whooping and hollering and kissing everything he could for the first time back seeing. The guy had to be thrilled. And we would love to leave him that way. But if this man's life were a cafeteria line, he would have just stepped from the sirloin to the broiled Brussels sprouts. Look at the reaction of the neighbors. Is not this the one who used to sit and beg? Others were saying, this is he. Still others were saying, no, but he is like him. He kept saying, I am the one. These folks don't celebrate, they debate. They've watched this man grope and trip since he was a kid. You'd think they would rejoice, but they don't. No recognition, no celebration. Why? Because apparently Jesus failed to consult the healing handbook. John writes, now it was a Sabbath on the day when Jesus made the clay and opened his eyes. The Pharisees were saying, this man is not from God because he does not keep the Sabbath. It all makes you wonder who was really blind that day. The neighbors didn't see the man. They saw a novelty. The church leaders didn't see the man. They saw a technicality. The man's parents didn't even see their son. They only saw a social difficulty. In the end, no one saw him, so they put him out. The fella had to be bewildered. Born blind only to be healed, healed only to be kicked out only to be left alone. It seems the man has been dealt more than his share of bad hands. Perhaps you can relate. Maybe you have encountered a similar string of negative turns one after another. You wonder if God sees your ongoing struggles, if he cares. If so, take heart from what happens next. Jesus heard they had thrown him out and went and found him. Jesus isn't content to heal the man and leave it there. He tracks down the troubled pauper. And when the man sees him, his spiritual eyes are opened as well. He believes in Jesus and worships him. Jesus' healing is completed, both physically and spiritually. As we look at these stories of healing in the Gospels, it's clear that Jesus understands our suffering and that he will use our pain for a purpose. Our problems, struggles, heartaches, and hassles cooperate toward one end, and that is the glory of God. Trust me in your times of trouble, God said, and I will rescue you, and you will give me glory. But there is another theme that stands out when we read of Jesus healing the sick in the Gospels, which brings us back to the woman we discussed at the beginning of the session. As you recall, she had been suffering from a chronic condition. Mark pinpoints the cause in his Gospel when he writes, she had been bleeding for 12 years, a chronic menstrual disorder, a perpetual issue of blood. Now, such a condition would be difficult for any woman of any era. But for a member of the Jewish race, nothing could be worse. Anything she touched was considered unclean. No washing dishes, no sweeping floors. She was physically exhausted and socially ostracized. No part of her life was left unaffected. She had suffered very much from many doctors and had spent all the money she had, but instead of improving, she was getting worse. She is a bruised reed. She awakes daily in a body that no one would want. She's down to her last prayer, and on the day we encounter her, she's about to pray it. For she has learned that Jesus is in her town. And by the time she gets to Jesus, he is surrounded by people. He's on the way to help the daughter of Jairus, the most important man in the community. What are the odds he will interrupt an urgent mission with a high official to help the likes of her? Very few. But what are the odds she will survive if she doesn't take a chance? Fewer still. So she takes a chance. If I can just touch his clothes, she thinks, I will be healed. It's a risky decision. To touch him, she will have to touch the people. If one of them recognizes her, it's hello, rebuke, goodbye, cure. But what choice does she have? She has no money, no clout, no friends, no solutions. All she has is a crazy hunch that Jesus can help and a high hope that he will. So she reaches out and she touches his garment, and immediately her bleeding stopped, and she felt in her body that she was freed from her suffering. What's important is not the form of the effort, but the fact of the effort. The fact is she did something. She refused to settle for sickness another day, and she resolved to make a move. This is the theme we find in many of the stories of healing found in the Gospels. Healing begins when we do something. Healing begins when we reach out. Healing starts when we take a step. It's interesting that only one person that day was commended for having faith. It wasn't a wealthy giver. It wasn't a loyal follower. It wasn't an acclaimed teacher. It was a shame-struck and penniless outcast who clutched onto a hunch that Jesus could and would help her. Which, by the way, isn't a bad definition of faith. A conviction that he can help and a hope that he will. Sounds similar to the definition of faith given by the author of the book of Hebrews. Without faith, no one can please God. Anyone who comes to God must believe that he is real and that he rewards those who truly want to find him. God's help is near and always available, but it is only given to those who seek it. Nothing results from apathy. The great work in this story is the mighty healing that occurred, but the great truth is that the healing began with the woman's touch. Her part in the healing itself was very small. All she did was extend her arm through the crowd, but that was all that was needed. And with that small, courageous gesture, she experienced Jesus' healing, tender power. When the prophet Isaiah foretold of Jesus, he described him as one who would take both our sin and our sickness. Surely he took up our pain, Isaiah wrote, and bore our suffering. He was pierced for our transgressions. He was crushed for our iniquities. When Matthew later saw the large number of healings in Galilee, he wrote, Jesus fulfilled Isaiah's well-known sermon. He took our illnesses. He carried our diseases. Jesus treated our sickness in the same way he treated our sin. He took it away. Now, this is still a fallen world, and sickness and sin still stalk our planet. But neither sin nor sickness will have dominion over God's people. Sin cannot condemn us. Disease cannot destroy us. In fact, the very sin and sickness that Satan intends for evil, God redeems for good. Sin becomes a showcase of His grace, and sickness becomes a demonstration of God's ability to heal. You need not live beneath the specter of uncontrollable plagues or emotions. Every fiber, molecule, and brainwave answers to His command. He is in charge. So, if you are sick, cry out to Jesus. He will heal you. He may do this instantly. One word was enough for Him to banish demons, heal epilepsy, and raise the dead. He may do this for you, or He may heal you gradually. In the case of the blind man we looked at earlier, Jesus healed him in stages. Your highest certainty, however, is that He will heal you ultimately. In heaven, God will restore your body to its intended splendor. As John wrote, when He is revealed, we shall be like Him. And God will turn your tomb into a womb, out of which you will be born with a perfect body. In the meantime, know that He understands what you are facing, and keep seeking Him in prayer.
All right, thank y'all. Y'all been a great audience. Will you just pray for Miss Rosemary and Miss Linda Pate's family and all through us? I saw my buddy Kathy Sasser. Was she might have gone to another group, but she's always with us. She's been so wonderful to care for Miss Linda. Hey, y'all have a great week and a great night, and I look forward to seeing you next weekend, okay? For Palm Sunday and the triumphant entry of Jesus.